We'll now proceed under the 5-minute rule for questions, and I will begin recognizing myself. Ms. Goitein, you said you gave us 2 of the ways you thought we should change the law. The first one had to do with clarifying that it was a significant change. And the second one was the idea that it ended after a certain number of days, 10 or 30 or whatever. Can you tell us, you had some others in your testimony. Can you go over those quickly? And then I'd like to ask Mr. Turley and Mr. Gerson to comment on your proposals.
Thank you for the question. My third recommendation was that Congress could renew states of emergency on a periodic basis up to 5 years. After 5 years, it can no longer be called an emergency. It has become a new normal of sorts. And at that point, Congress should be passing permanent laws or laws potentially with sunsets in order to address the phenomenon, rather than to pretend that it is still an unforeseen circumstance that's going on. The fourth recommendation I made is right now, under the National Emergencies Act, when the president declares an emergency, he has access to any of the statutes that are available during a national emergency, even if they are facially irrelevant to the nature of the emergency. There is no requirement in the Act that there be some kind of connection. Now, a few of those laws, like 10 U.S.C. 2808, have some additional language that cabins how they can be used. Most of them do not, and there's no reason for that, and it invites abuse. So the law should clarify that emergency powers can only be used to address, for the purpose of addressing that emergency and not for any other emergency. Fifth, the law should make clear that emergency power can never be used as an end run around Congress. So if the current Congress has had an opportunity to consider and vote on the circumstances that lead to the emergency declaration, then the president cannot use a national emergency to get around what Congress, the current Congress, has decided. Finally, there should be greater transparency in terms of how presidents are using emergency powers. Right now, the president has to report every 6 months on expenditures related to the emergency. These reports have been filed since 2003. They've gone missing. I think Congress is getting them, but they're not publicly available. There should be a requirement, first of all, that the reports be made public, and second, that the reports cover not just expenses, but the details of what activities and what programs have been put in place with classified annexes where necessary. So those are my recommendations.
Thank you. And first, let me ask you this. On your first recommendation, it was that there's significant, that only if there exists significant change in factual circumstances that pose an imminent threat to the police powers or pressing national interest. The president could say that there is this factual change on the border. And if he did such, how does that first recommendation, how would that interface with our current circumstance?
In the current circumstance, I believe the only change that he has pointed to as a factual matter is that there are more families coming to the border seeking asylum. And of course, these individuals are coming to make claims they are entitled to make under the law, and they are seeking lawful entry into the United States. So that is not contributing to the problem of unlawful migration, which he cited as the emergency in the declaration. He hasn't cited any change in circumstances, any unforeseen developments, which is what an emergency is, other than that one.
Well, and maybe you're right, and I'm missing it in his official declaration, but in his verbiage, he's talked about drugs pouring in, and he's talked about the women being bound and taped, and you name it. And that's something new, I think. It's so new that it doesn't exist.
It's new that he's talking about it. I think what we have to understand is that a problem is not the same thing as an emergency. Even a very serious problem is not the same thing as an emergency. Emergency has a meaning. It's not that obscure a word, and it does relate to unforeseen, sudden changes in circumstances that require an immediate response. Most of the things the president has talked about, drugs, unlawful border crossings, crime, are things that if you look at the government's own statistics, they're not getting worse. If anything, they are getting better.
Thank you. Professor Turley, what are your thoughts about her 5 recommendations, and do you have any others that are addition to that?
Well, I think I haven't really looked very closely at the recommendations by my fellow witness, but I would put up a cautionary flag that you should not try to write with such specificity that you turn this into an endless form of litigation and debate over the meaning of what's a problem, what's an emergency. You can define emergencies, but I think the key failure of the NEA is that this body doesn't have to take an affirmative act to allow an emergency declaration to continue. As I say in my testimony, originally the bill had that in it. Originally the Congress did the right thing and said that after a certain period, we have to affirmatively agree that there's an emergency and for it to continue. So without that agreement, it is a dead letter. That was removed at the insistence of the Ford administration. That could solve a lot of these problems. You wouldn't have to get into all of the weeds as to, what type of conditions are going to trigger what type of provisions, as long as this body had to affirmatively agree that an emergency existed. Then you could hold a hearing and address many of the fine issues that my co-witness has identified, and I agree entirely that those are relevant factors to consider.
Thank you. Mr. Gerson?
Well, I'm not sure that life can continue very well without this act altogether. Because one starts with the Constitution, but speaking to the act ended, remember that its purpose was to clear the deck of a bunch of emergencies that were a decade old and were littering the field. And remember also that your fundamental power that undergirds any of this is the power of the purse. And so what you ought to be doing, it seems to me, is by amending this statute clearly, and everybody agrees about this, that you need a clear, plain English definition of what constitutes an emergency. What you're saying is we're giving license to the executive to carry on this basis without our intervening to cut off that activity by taking action with relationship to finance, what your Article 1 powers are. So you need to you're thinking about process when you do this. And as I say, I start with the Constitution. First and foremost, I think a clear definition, some practicable time frame should be attached to that, and the rest should be up to considering how this actually will work in practice, how Congress can play a meaningful role, particularly the House, which has this ability to originate revenue bills and appropriations bills, and how that will work in practice. That shouldn't inhibit a president, for example, with respect to the exigencies of exercising the war powers or foreign affairs powers, assuming that there's an emergency. Avoid those kinds of problems. Avoid the kinds of problems that the Tonkin Gulf resolution created. I think with historical reference, with a look back, with some common sense, you can simplify this, make it clear, define what your role is, and take a much more activist role, given the limited but very profound power that the House of Representatives has.